Yo, what's up, RotoGrinders, and welcome to Sharp DFS Analysis here on RotoGrinders.com. My name is Chris Gimino. I am an analyst here at RG, and we'll be going over the Week 17 action with two of the smartest guys in the business. Joining us in the absence of Warren Sharp, we've got BobbyFi filling in. Bobby, what's going on, man?
Hey, man, happy to be here with you. It's going to be tough to fill in for Warren Sharp, but going to do my best, and really happy to be doing the show with you guys.
You know Bobby from RotoGrinders, and also you may have seen him near the top of tournament leaderboards from time to time. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the Week 17 action, and we're going to try to get things done for the listeners. Also joining me, we've got the senior DFS editor of 4for4.com, Chris Raybon. Raybon, what's happening?
What's going on, man? Last show before the New Year, so it's ended on a good note.
Hell yeah, let's get it done. We've got a lot to talk about. It's Week 17, and realistically, we have a lot of information in front of us, and a lot of it's actually going to change before you even listen to the show. So what we're going to do is start the show and just talk really basically about the motivations of the teams that are fighting for something this week. And, you know, you probably heard it other places this week. That's fine. Never hurts to get this banged into your skull one last time before you start to make your lineups this weekend, because quite frankly, it's very, very, very important to understand who's going to be on the field. It's not exactly like the other weeks where it was pretty clear, crystal clear. This guy starts the game, he's probably going to get X number of touches. Well, it's not always that clear in Week 17, depending on the motivations of the team. So, Bobby, I'll start with you. We're going to the AFC. Let's talk about the Bills real quick. They're going to be needing a win and some help to get into the playoffs here, so they'll be facing the Miami Dolphins. And, obviously the Bills are going to not exactly know what their situation is, so we expect them to be playing full out here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is one of the spots you can definitely look to attack. I know I'm very interested in LaShawn McCoy with the value that's opening up. He's one of the higher-end running backs that I'm definitely looking at this week. And, they have something to play for. So that's not true for a lot of teams this week. And like you said, it's a really, really different kind of week. So hopefully I still am figuring it out as we go, because we're just getting information, as the show is coming on. We got DeMarco Murray ruled out. So there's a lot of things to look at. But, the Bills are definitely a spot. What they're going to bring. They're going to try, and they need to win this game. So we can expect them to go full out here.
One of the things they need, Chris, is they need the Titans to lose in this spot. They're going to be up against the Jaguars, and according to all indications, the Jaguars are not exactly taking their foot off the gas here in this spot. We'll have to remains to be seen whether or not Coughlin and co. are going to actually try to pull that Giants nonsense where they play all out the last game of the season, try to keep the Titans out of the playoffs here, especially since I think there's some chance they could actually end up playing the Titans in the next week. So what's the deal here with the Titans? We got no DeMarco Murray. We'll talk about this game a little bit more in the next segment, but any news and notes about their motivation?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Jaguars, if they win the game, they would essentially knock Tennessee out of the playoffs and not have to play them. If they lose the game, the most likely thing is they're going to end up playing the Titans. So we've seen in the past when teams are gonna, about to play a team the next week, they do take their foot off the gas. But it's interesting because since this is a Vegas show, most of the over-unders for these games have gone down. Stay open because we've gotten news of teams resting players. This is the one game, I believe, at least as we record this now, where the over-under is actually higher than it was when it opened. It opened at 41, and I'm looking at 41.5 right now. So, the line has changed where it's gotten a lot tighter. Tennessee opened as a 6-point favorite, so I think there was this assumption that Jacksonville was going to rest their players. Now it looks like odds makers are starting and bettors are starting to take more seriously that they're not going to rest their players. And we kind of saw this last season with a team like the Giants when they had a meaningless Week 17 game. They were in the playoffs already, but they played the Redskins hard and actually beat them and kept them out of the playoffs. So I'm not writing off Jacksonville here and saying they're going to kind of just completely take the foot off the gas in the middle of the game. I'm treating this. I think you have to treat this like a normal game. And but as you said, DeMarco Murray ruled out. Derrick Henry should get a huge workload, and the Jaguars have been somewhat of a run funnel this season with that league best pass defense. They've been a little more average against the run. So I think that is the way to attack them, and Henry will get a huge workload.
Yeah, so that's an interesting game to keep an eye on. 42 is the total in Pinnacle, so 3-point favorites there for the Tennessee Titans. A little bit more on that in just a minute. We got the Chargers. They're going to be obviously needing to win to get in. Looks like Melvin Gordon's going to try to give it a go, Bobby. How do you read that backfield situation real quick?
Yeah, I think that you would. I think Melvin Gordon, assuming he plays, is definitely in play. There's other guys who I probably am leaning more towards. I think I'm more interested in the passing game in this one. I just don't know how healthy he is, and I think that when all else fails, San Diego's team tends to rely on Rivers. So that's sort of how I'm trying to attack the San Diego spot. I think that Rivers and Allen are both really, really, really high on my board.
Baltimore Ravens, Chris, are going to, be likely to earn a wild card spot here in this game. It looks like Burfict going to be out for the Bengals, so probably going to be a run script here for the Ravens, or do you see it differently than I do?
Oh, no, the Ravens always would prefer to run the football. That's why they brought in Greg Roman this year. They led the league in pass attempts the last few years. So I think you're going to see a heavy dose of Alex Collins. He plays a little over 50% of the snaps, but usually a lot for about at least 18 touches, and he's been getting targeted more in the passing game. The concern is always Javorius Allen gets subbed in kind of. There's no rhyme or reason. He will get red zone carries. He will get carries inside the 10. So I think Collins is in play, but you just have to keep in mind that there's a chance he could get vultured on the goal line or just lose some snaps, especially if they go up big late in the game, because he is their best player on offense right now. For those who haven't really seen many Raven games, I don't blame you. But Collins has kind of transformed into the best player that Baltimore has on offense. He's their most explosive player. He's the best player at making tacklers miss. So that's the concern there. But the matchup is sets up really well for him. They are between 9.5 and 10-point home favorites, depending where you look. So good script for Baltimore running backs in this one. Just wish Collins got a few more snaps.
Bobby, looks like the Steelers are punting this week. No Le'Veon Bell. No Big Ben for the matchup here. How are you kind of interpreting this spot for both the Steelers and the Browns? Because quite frankly, I don't necessarily think that the line here makes like perfect sense to me. The Steelers are still big favorites against the Browns, and with no Big Ben, no Antonio Brown, no Le'Veon Bell, do you think the Browns actually have a chance here in this spot? They are currently getting 7 points. The over-under, by the way, is 36.5.
Yeah, I think they do. I think I'm staying away from the offenses for the most part in this one, although I am going to take some shots on Josh Gordon on the Cleveland side of the ball. I don't think that the Pittsburgh side, I just can't figure out where I want to go except for their defense. I'm interested in, I believe I'm picking on Kaiser. I still think that in this actual game that you have a real chance for Cleveland to actually pull out a victory, their first victory of the year. But for the most part, the guys I'm looking at are just really the Steelers defense. And Josh Gordon is pretty much it for me.
Looks like the Kansas City Chiefs are also going to be resting some guys here, Chris. That means we're going to get Pat Mahomes at the starting quarterback position for the Kansas City Chiefs. Ridiculously cheap on DFS sites. Does that mean we should be looking at the preseason superstar as someone to target here in DFS, or are you kind of a little bit skeptical that, going against the Broncos, that he could struggle in his first NFL start?
I'm a little skeptical. I know if Warren were here, he'd probably launch into something about, how tough it is for, to go play in Mile High, and, this defense still has some veterans and whatnot. And, I kind of buy into that narrative. Anytime you have a quarterback making their first start and it's on the road, and then you add in Mile High, and you still have, some good players on Denver. They're playing for pride here. Kansas City really has nothing to play for. So, even if Mahomes is out there really excited, it's his first start. He's giving it his all. Who knows about the motivation for the other players on the team? I mean, you have offensive linemen, you have backs, you have receivers, and, who knows where their motivation's at and what kind of supporting cast he's even going to be rolling with. Whereas Denver, I mean, aside from normal injured players, it doesn't look like they're necessarily going to be resting anyone on defense. So I think that's a really tough matchup for Mahomes. I get it. I get the theoretical upside there. So, in a tournament, we've seen crazier things happen, but I'm not really a player that I want to target too much, especially because I've, heard a lot of other people kind of want to be on him. So there's just not as much leverage there, I don't think. And there's a ton of options. I mean, it's a 16-game slate, 32 quarterbacks here. There's a lot of ways you could go. So it's not somebody I'm really excited about. I think he could struggle on the road in Mile High against Von Miller and Aqib Talib and Chris Harris and company.
Bobby, sometimes you don't know what to do with the Patriots, and sometimes they're 16-point home favorites with one available running back. I think it's pretty clear what to do with Dion Lewis this week.
Yeah, you play him. There's pretty much not anything else to do about it. And I totally agree with Chris about Mahomes. By the way, I just wanted to throw that in. I think the future for Mahomes is incredibly bright. I love this guy as an actual player, but this is not a great situation to go play your first game at Mile High. But yeah, I think that you play Dion Lewis, and that's pretty much it. Like, I really am just that's my entire interest in that game. I'm not going to buy into that they're going to try and throw the ball and score 500 points. I think that you're going to get a lot of work from Lewis, and that's mostly where I'm looking.
All right, Chris, let's jump to the NFC, where the Seahawks, they're going to need some help to get in the playoffs here. We're looking at a relatively tough matchup by the numbers here against Arizona, and a team that just hasn't played all that well on offense when the Seahawks. Where do you stand on Russ Wilson and the passing game in this spot? Obviously, we know they just can't run the ball.
Yeah, I like Russell Wilson. I like him every week, pretty much after seeing what he's done, kind of starting the early to the middle part of the season. Russell Wilson still leads the league in games of 24 or more, DraftKings points with 9, even after a couple of clunkers these last few weeks. And, this is a kind of an unmotivated Arizona team. I mean, they really have nothing to play for except getting to 500. They're going to the link where the crowd is going to be fired up, and they have a real chance to make the playoffs. And as you mentioned, I think it really just comes down to the fact that Russell Wilson is Seattle's offense. 82% of their offensive yardage and 30, all but one of their touchdowns. So given that, I think Wilson is a high upside tournament option. I know his price is kind of up there to where people are kind of looking and saying there's so many other quarterbacks on the slate. I don't need to pay up for Wilson, but there's also so much value on the slate that, if Wilson happens to be that high scoring quarterback or that top 3 quarterback on the slate, which is definitely within his range of outcomes, I think that, he makes for a nice play, especially in GPPs.
Bobby, the last time I saw Julio Jones facing the Carolina Panthers, he was dropping my hopes and dreams in the end zone after a busted zone coverage. A week where he wasn't necessarily all that highly owned, to say the least. Was disappointing when that happened. Now we're getting Carolina coming off the last 4 weeks, giving up the most points to the wide receiver position, and they absolutely are looking to win this game. What's the deal here with the Falcons, and what do you think about Julio and Matt Ryan this week?
I'm obsessed with Julio. I'm going to play him. I did have 100% of him that week, so that big drop really, really did hurt me. But I'm going right back to it. I think that Julio is my number 1 receiver on the board. I think they're going to go down swinging. If they're going to go down, they're going to go down going to Julio. So I'm obsessed with Julio. I'm going to play a ton of him. I'm using Wilson most places as my quarterback, so I'm not going to play as much Matt Ryan, even though the price makes sense. It's just he's really been awful for the most part this year in terms of fantasy and in reality as well. But I'm all about Julio Jones. I'm going to have him pretty much everywhere.
They are 4-point favorites against the Carolina Panthers, Chris. And when you take a look at the other side of the ball and what Cam Newton's been able to do in their recent stretch of success, are you expecting them to find some offense on the other side of this that makes this game somewhat stackable? Or is this kind of a situation where you think there's going to be too much ownership, too much attention on a 16-game slate to really get excited about the spot?
I think this is an interesting game for me, and as we record this, one that I'm not my kind of outlook hasn't fully formed yet, because as I'm looking at this game, and this is a Vegas show, so we should talk about this. The line on that game opened at 47, the over/under, and now it's down to 45. And the Falcons have also gained a half a point on the line, so there is some kind of skepticism with this Carolina Panther offense, which is interesting because the Falcons have really struggled with their pass defense in the last 4 games, even though opponents haven't put up crazy numbers on the scoreboard. Over the past 4 weeks, the Falcons have allowed 99 of 128 passing. That's a 77.3 completion percentage. They've also allowed 8.1 yards per attempt over that span, with 8 touchdown passes and just 2 interceptions. So Atlanta has been vulnerable through the air. However, there seems to be some skepticism about whether this is a good spot for Carolina going on the road. They did struggle somewhat with Tampa Bay last week, a little bit of a lower scoring game than you might have predicted. I know there was a kick return in there, which kind of essentially took a drive away from Carolina, but Carolina didn't really blow Tampa Bay out of the water the way you might have thought they would. So I do kind of see both sides to it here. I think Cam Newton is a guy that I wouldn't be scared of playing just because he's got double-digit rush attempts over his last 3 games, actually averaging 13.3 attempts per game over his last 3. And that rushing floor gives him about, I think in 10 of his last 11 games, he's got at least 4.4 rushing points. So it kind of gives you a little extra floor with Cam, and we know the ceiling is there, especially with the way Atlanta's been struggling. So I'm not scared of him, but, just want listeners out there to know there is some skepticism, I guess, of Carolina maybe going on the road, laying an egg. They're not as motivated as Atlanta. So maybe, if other things break a certain way and Carolina gets down, they even might not go full throttle here. Cam's been on the injury report with a shoulder, and, some other guys a little bit banged up as well. So that's kind of an interesting one. I think you got to kind of leave it for tournaments a little more. But, Cam Newton's always a guy that he can match any quarterback on the slate's upside.
Yeah, that line did drop, and I'm a little bit skeptical right now because of how early in the week it is, and it is week 17. 64% of the tickets, but 94% of the money on the under in that game. Not completely convinced that that's not some sort of a setup move. I mean, with that kind of lopsided nature, I don't know with the line of even at 47 with these two teams, if everyone's just that convinced that the under is going to hit in this game. So a little bit curious to see if that line moves back the other direction as we get closer to game time. I'm not making a statement either way. I don't think you can know anything just by those numbers or that information, but certainly you made some good points about why people might be expecting the Panthers to struggle here on the road in this particular situation, if that is in fact the case. Let's talk about the Saints here, Bobby. They are going to want to win to make sure they get a wild card home game here. They're not going to want to slip to that 5 seed. What's the take here on the Saints? How do you think that they are going to attack in this spot?
I think that, for me, the number one it's Kamara. He's my favorite. He's my favorite play in the game, probably. I don't mind anybody else, Breeze, Thomas. I think everybody's in play. But for me, the most of my interest in this one on that side of the ball is definitely on Kamara. I don't mind running it back with, some of Tampa Bay. I actually don't think that I just can't figure out where to go. I mean, you got a good price on Evans, but Lattimore has been an absolute lockdown except for last week against Julio. I just think that it's a spot where I'm still trying to figure out the Tampa Bay side of it, but on the New Orleans side, for me, it's mostly Kamara with a little bit of Thomas and Breeze.
Yeah, I think this game is a really interesting one because I believe it's the highest over-under we have now, opened at around 50 or 51, depending where you look, and it's still sitting up there. It has dropped a point, maybe a half a point, also depending where you look. But on one side of the ball, I think there's some interesting kind of trends to note actually on both sides of the ball here. So, or in the running and passing game for the Saints. On the running game side, the whole Ingram versus Kamara thing. First, I'll start by saying that both of those guys every week have week winning upside. They both have top overall running back upside. I know a lot of times people feel like they have to kind of choose and take a stand, and only one guy's the right player. Where in reality, both of those guys have overall running back one within their range of outcomes every week. But I did notice some interesting trends. So from week 6, which was the first game when Adrian Peterson was not on the Saints roster any longer, till week 13, which was the game before Kamara left with a concussion. For those that remember, Mark Ingram was averaging 20.6 touches per game from week 6 to 13. Kamara only 13.9 touches per game. Then, when Kamara came back from that concussion, these last 2 weeks now, Kamara 18.5 touches per game, Ingram only 16.5. So Kamara has finally started to out-touch Ingram. And it's not just, in terms of the touches, it's also in terms of how the offense is running. And I heard a commentator, I'm not sure if it was this week, the week before, but talking about the Saints offense and quoting, I believe it was either Drew Brees or Sean Payton, but they said, after Kamara left that game with the concussion, they had to really recalibrate because so much of their offense is built around Kamara now. And they had to really, take a while, just like a quarter, to figure out what they could do and what they couldn't with him off the field. And the numbers kind of back that up because over these last 2 weeks, Kamara is getting a touch on 53.6% of his snaps, whereas from week 6 to 13, he was only getting a touch on 41.6% of his snaps. So Kamara's touching the ball on 12 percentage points higher of his snaps over these last 2 weeks compared to earlier in the season. And for Ingram, that trend is kind of reversed a bit, where from week 6 to 13, Ingram was touching the ball on 58% of his snaps, but over the last 2 weeks, that's down to just 45%. So the snaps aren't changing as much as just the utilization for those two guys, where they're kind of making Kamara more of a focal point. And then for Michael Thomas, one thing I think is interesting with him is that, Tampa Bay, ever since they got destroyed by Julio in week 12, they gave up the 253 yards and 2 touchdowns on 12 catches in week 12 to Julio Jones. They've been a lot better versus opponents' number 1 perimeter receiver. In week 13, they held Devontae Adams to just 4 catches and 42 yards on 6 targets. Week 14, Marvin Jones just 3 catches for 64 yards on only 4 targets. And in week 15, they were able to shut down Julio, only 3 catches and 54 yards on 8 targets. And then last week, Devin Funchess, only 4 targets and 3 catches for 11 yards. So Tampa Bay has been better over these last 4 weeks at containing opposing number 1 perimeter wide receivers. Obviously Michael Thomas is going to get a ton of target share as long as he's healthy, but just something to keep in mind there.
Yeah, certainly Ryan Smith hasn't been the one contributing to most of that. They are crediting most of what Tampa Bay is allowing to him by the looks of it. I mean, the guy, has only got a couple of guys above him in like 3 or 4 different categories: yards per attempt, yards allowed, touchdowns allowed, as far as his stats and coverage this season. He hasn't even played the whole season, and he's creeping up there in a lot of those categories. Really a guy that you'd like to see your number 1 wide receiver getting covered by one-on-one. Unfortunately, as we talked about pre-show, Chris, these wide receiver cornerback matchups, they're not always as easy to spot as we seem to make them believe. But certainly Michael Thomas not in a terrible spot, but you make some good points there about what Tampa Bay has done the last couple of weeks here. So that's certainly worth keeping in mind when you go to make your selections from the Saints this week. Bobby, let's talk about the Los Angeles Rams. They are resting tons of guys. You're not going to get Goff. You're not going to get Gurley. You're probably not getting any of the starting wide receivers for any significant time in this game. What in the hell is going on with Sean Mannion, and what are we doing for DFS with these guys?
For me, I've been trying to figure this one out for a while because I've got a lot of people telling me to play the Niners defense, and I think that's just a foolish move. I still believe in the system the Rams run. They're going to have some success against this Niners defense, and the guy I'm actually most interested in is Josh Reynolds. I don't know where the ownership's going to end up on him. You would probably have a better idea about that than I would. But assuming that we really don't see these guys, he's a guy at minimum cost who I believe in as a talent, just from being in LA and from what you hear around around the Twitter sphere or whatever. They like this kid, and I actually believe in him. So I think that he's in a decent spot. If Woods isn't out, he's going to eat up a lot of that role, even though you don't have Goff throwing the ball. It's not like these guys aren't NFL players. I mean, Mannion, whatever, he's still in the NFL. I think that you can get some real value here, and I think there's real upside for a guy like Reynolds. He's the guy I'm most interested in on the Rams side of the ball.
Yeah, Bobby, don't at me about ownership this weekend if Sunday rolls along and something's not perfect here. This is going to be a very challenging week. I will do my damnedest, though, to try to get a pretty good projection here on RotoGrinders.com as far as ownership is concerned. I'm sure Chris will be doing the same 144. Let's talk about what's happening with the Minnesota Vikings, Chris. We've got a situation where they're probably going to want to be winning this game. They're motivated, certainly, to do so. The matchup doesn't necessarily speak volumes as far as a spot we would normally want to target, especially not on a 16-game slate. But very few teams have the kind of motivation they have, and they are one of the better teams in the league. How are you treating these players, especially the wide receivers like Thielen and Diggs?
I think both of those guys are in play, as is Case Keenum. Let's not forget Case Keenum, because if you're looking for kind of, that quarterback that's going to be low owned and, he has everything in place that he could have a big game, I think Keenum is it because he has the 2 wide receivers. He has a defense that, an opponent that they're not – I wouldn't say they're not an elite defense as much as they just kind of limit opposing possessions and play pretty solidly, but they can be beat. I mean, they're kind of an average defense, 14th in overall DVOA, 14th against the pass, 13th against the rush in Chicago. So the one thing to keep in mind with them is they are 20th in DVOA versus number 1 receivers. So I think Adam Thielen is kind of a sneaky play where we know that he has that upside. We know the talent is there, and he's kind of been quiet these last few weeks. But now with looks like you're going to have to kind of you're going to have a lot of salary to play around with this week. So you can actually afford a guy like Thielen who's going to get a lot lower ownership than I think Julio and Michael Thomas and guys like that. I think Thielen's in a good spot. Diggs has actually been out targeting Thielen over these last few weeks, kind of reclaimed that number one. But I think both of these guys are supremely talented. I think there's not going to be too much resistance there. It's just a matter of, does Minnesota want to go extremely run heavy and just kind of get out of there with a win? That's the only question. But I could certainly see Thielen or Diggs making a big play. But I did want to go back to that Rams 49ers game for a minute, just because I think there's a lot, to talk about just beyond even just Josh Reynolds, who I like a lot. But there's just so much at play here because, you have to think about, okay, well, the Rams now, they're going to be resting starters. So it's not just that, okay, you're going to sub in Mannion and Reynolds and Malcolm Brown at the running back position, but you also have a few offensive linemen resting. You're going to have no Andrew Whitworth. And so you're going to have a few backup O-linemen playing in this game. So I think that it could be challenging for this Rams team just with backup offensive linemen. Reuben Foster, the linebacker for San Francisco, has been playing extremely well. He is PFF's number 4 rated linebacker overall this season. He's number 3 run, and San Francisco really shutting the run down. So earlier in the week, I was, Malcolm Brown was kind of looking like that free square and that guy you can just plug in. But now there's so much value has opened up that I don't even think Malcolm Brown is, no longer he's no longer a must play or anything like that, just because there's so much value all the way around. But if you just look at what San Francisco has done in run defense over these past few weeks, over the last 3 weeks, just 198 yards allowed on 68 carries to running backs. So they're allowing under 3 yards per carry to running backs over the past 3 weeks. I think Malcolm Brown, he's going to have to make hay in the passing game, which is where San Francisco really does struggle. They struggle a lot at covering running backs out of the backfield. Malcolm Brown has executed a ton of screen passes. If you watch his tape throughout this year when he's been on the field, he has some catches and he has been able to get double-digit chunks of yards on those. I think he's going to need that to kind of produce there. But, from a Vegas perspective, it's interesting as well because this game is a game where it's the Rams are still implied for 20 points, which is pretty high considering they're going to start, a backup quarterback, backup running back, backup wide receivers, backup O-linemen and stuff like that. They still have a 20-point implied total, which, for some context, I mean, Dallas's implied point total is around the same place, and they're probably going to have Dak and Zeke going against a Philly team that's going to rest some people. So, there is some, I guess, there's a lot of optimism for the Rams, and I think their receiving core is going to be Josh Reynolds on the outside. You're probably going to have Mike Thomas on the other side, and then Farrell Cooper in the slot. I think Farrell Cooper is another name where, especially on a site like DraftKings, I think Cooper could get a ton of volume. Reynolds is your big play guy. He's kind of the outside guy that you expect to get the red zone targets and some deep shots. But Cooper's the guy I could see get 5, 6, 7 catches if he's going to play the whole game. So just a lot of interesting things there. And then on the other side, you got to think if the Rams are resting players on offense, they're probably also resting players on defense. Looks like Aaron Donald's not going to play. So this is another situation where I think Jimmy Garoppolo has a chance to really keep it going because the Rams aren't going to be going full tilt. And if you take Aaron Donald out of the mix of that defense, that really limits to a large extent what Wade Phillips can now do. And you might just see a more vanilla defense going to get for Jimmy Garoppolo. And, he played well against the Jaguars last week where the 49ers put up 44 points against this number 1 defense in the league in the Jacksonville Jaguars. So this is a situation where just a lot of interesting things regarding this game. If Jimmy Garoppolo is scoring and putting up points on the Rams, that kind of creates a situation where maybe now you're looking at a potential shootout and maybe that's how these receivers come to hit value and maybe even, Malcolm Brown catching a lot of checkdowns. So I think that's a really fascinating game, and that's when I encourage people to kind of do the research on and check out, which Rams players they like and which 49ers players that they like as well. I don't know if it's necessarily about the defense in this game on either side of the ball as much as it is that there will be value on the offensive side of the ball for both teams.
I give Blake Bortles all the credit in the world for playing better this season, but, despite the fact that trending performance-wise, the 49ers have been pretty good against the run, 18th season long, but just 9th the last 4 weeks or so in terms of rushing efficiency allowed. we're talking about a team that allowed hundreds and hundreds of yards to Blake Bortles up and down the field late in that game last week. So you talk about a shootout potential here. If the Rams do struggle to run the ball, have some confidence in the play caller, have some confidence in some of those backup talents that maybe this could be a game where there's some offense, and think that all the points you made are tremendous, Chris. Kudos to you as far as breaking down that game. Bobby, one last game to talk about from a motivations standpoint, or one last team, I should say. Chris mentioned them. It's the Eagles. They are 13-2. They are not likely to play a ton of guys who matter in this game. They've already ruled out several guys, or at least mentioned that they're going to not play the entire game. So what's the situation here with the Eagles? Obviously, I think we have to avoid guys like Foles and the starting offensive players. Is there any other usable asset that you think is available in this game from this team?
Because it's such a massive week and there's so much else out there, to be honest with you, I don't really have any Eagles on my anywhere right now. That could change, but as of right now, I'm sort of staying away from this spot. I don't feel comfortable with it, and there's enough other places I can find value that I don't feel like I need to go here. I may be missing something, though, so I'd be interested to hear what Chris has to say if there's something maybe I'm overlooking.
No, I think earlier in the week, the guy I was hoping for was Trey Burton, the tight end. If Zach Ertz was to get ruled out, I think Trey Burton would be in for kind of, as he's shown in the past, he kind of takes on that Ertz role as the receiving tight end. But if they're going to play kind of the starters for a little while and then the backups, and then, the backup quarterback is Sudfeld, I believe. So he's pretty unproven. We really have no idea what he can do in this week in real life game action. So it's kind of a stay away there. I'm sure somebody will end up with a good fantasy day. It's just really difficult to pinpoint. I would have liked if they were going to rule guys out. I was kind of looking at Burton and maybe Corey Clement if he was going to get more of a full workload, or somebody like Wendell Smallwood getting a full workload. But as of now, yeah, it just kind of looks like they're going to split it up between everybody.
All right, awesome stuff, guys. We kind of mixed our two segments there. We're going to go over what would normally be our second segment now, in which we would be talking about the over-unders of each game, which game we think we could take advantage of from a betting perspective, and also from a DFS perspective, which games could go over the total, which favorites could struggle, which underdogs could succeed. But now we'll kind of blend our last conversation into some games we didn't talk about as much in that particular segment. I want to talk about Houston and Indianapolis, Bobby, and Chris too, because I want to hear what both of you guys have to say about this game. We're looking at no DeAndre Hopkins for the Texans. We're looking at their, third string quarterback, essentially TJ Yates out there. We're looking at a team that lacks motivation in every sense of the word, if I can imagine an NFL player could be lacking motivation other than wanting to put some good stuff out there on tape, as they always will want to do. But as far as the playoffs, as far as any meaningful issue and win-loss, it's just not there for that team. And I don't think that the Colts are much different, but they've been playing like that way for weeks. So if you talk about a defense that could potentially be out some guys too, I think I saw that Kareem Jackson could potentially miss this game. They're already not playing very well in the secondary, Bobby. There's just a lot of angles to take advantage of here from an offensive perspective. If you're looking at the Indianapolis Colts, how do you feel about Brissett? How do you feel about T.Y. Hilton? How do you feel about Frank Gore and all these guys on the Colts? Because this spot looks pretty good. 5.5-point favors, 40 over/under at home for the Colts.
Yeah, and you get the narrative of it possibly being Gore's last game. At least that's what we're hearing. But for me, I'm mostly interested. Hilton absolutely dismantled this Houston Texans team in Houston. I love T.Y., I love Doyle, and I love Brissett. Those are probably the three guys I'm probably using the heaviest. I'm a little disappointed with the Hopkins being out, because I think it did change my love for this game stack, and that was really where I wanted to go. I still think you can do it. I just don't think it's quite as exciting as it was before. Fuller on the other side, but for the most part, I think Brissett makes for an excellent play. He's not going to – this is him playing, he's playing for his future. Also, these guys have chances, and we've seen what guys can do in Week 17 have a big impact on their future overall. And with Luck coming back, obviously, next year, he's not going to be there. But, I don't know. I think this is a real spot where you go for Brissett, you play Hilton, and you play Doyle. I don't even mind all three of them in the same lineup if you want to run it back with Fuller on the other side.
All right, Chris, what do you think? This game is somewhat interesting to me. I know that we're going to see a lot of ownership in DFS on T.Y. Hilton, probably see a little bit on the quarterback as well. I don't think you're going to see a ton on the Indianapolis side, maybe sort of a Jack Doyle as far as ownership in DFS is concerned. Do you think this is a spot where you could find some leverage anyway.
Yeah, I kind of agree with with everything that was just said. It's a good spot for Hilton. I think that's the guy I was really zoned in on. This is the type of situation where I like to play Hilton, at home, indoors against a bad pass defense that has been beaten down the field as the Houston Texans have. Their if you look at air yards allowed, they're right there at the top of the league in terms of the teams just throwing the ball down the field on them. So I think T.Y. Hilton is really the guy that stands out. But then you do have the narrative of Frank Gore, not only potentially being his last game, but he is 149 yards shy of 1,000 rushing on the year. And we've already seen them give him, 30 plus carries in a game. So it's not out of the question that, if they want to make him, I believe he joined like some kind of company as like one of the oldest people to rush for 1,000 or the oldest. I don't know I forget exactly what it is, but I've seen it kind of circulating on Twitter. And Gore did play 74% of the snaps last week, and his season average is only about 53. So it does seem like they're kind of letting him get that workload as the season kind of goes into the dust. So I think you look at Gore, and I think he's a guy that you could look to for some value, even though he hasn't shown a huge ceiling. This could be a game where they give him the goal line work, they give him a lot of carries, and then I think it's T.Y. Hilton. I think Doyle's always kind of in play is just because he has such a large market share of the tight end, of the Indianapolis Colts passing game. But one thing to keep in mind too is when you look at kind of Hilton and Doyle, in Hilton's big games, Doyle's usually a little quieter, and I guess that's just because if Hilton's kind of doing, eating up chunk yardage, there's not as much there for those kind of underneath completions to Doyle. But I think Hilton is probably my favorite play in this game. I do like Brissett a lot, and I think Will Fuller has a lot of upside too. I like him as a tournament play a lot. I think if this game does go with that kind of Brissett to Hilton game flow where they can hit on a couple of passes and they're firing on all cylinders, you're going to have a situation where it's like an opposing passing game correlation. Houston's still going to have to play the game. And, you could see a situation where Will Fuller, we already know he gets a lot of air yards, a lot of targets deep down the field. You could have a situation where if they're in comeback mode, he's getting double-digit targets with a lot of stuff down the field and maybe mixing in some easy completions in a prevent defense. So I think Will Fuller has a ton of upside. I wouldn't be surprised, for example, to see Will Fuller finish as a top 3, top 5 wide receiver. And then the other thing to watch in this game is Alfred Blue has actually been kind of serving as the lead back over these past few weeks over Lamar Miller. So he's a guy that we could see him get a full workload as they go into evaluation mode for next year as well, and kind of Lamar Miller taking a bit of a backseat.
That makes sense, but I think I'd rather lose than play Alfred Blue in DFS pretty much forever, pretty much until there is no more DFS to be played. Of course, that's probably not exactly true, but I'm certainly on a 16-game slate trying to find better options there than the TJ Yates-led Texans offense and Alfred Blue. But again, that is certainly something to watch if he is going to be taking that lead role. Perhaps there is an off chance if you're trying to play in some massive tournaments that he's the guy that gets you where you want to go. But let's talk about something I think is more likely to get you where you want to go this week, Bobby. And Chris, once again, too, I want to hear your take on this game because it's just very interesting to me when I look at the injury report for the Green Bay Packers in a game that's a 43 over-under 7-point favorite for the Lions. We're talking about Mike Daniels, defensive tackle. He's questionable. Devontae Adams is out. Jari Evans is out. Nick Perry, he's out. Aaron Jones is out. Richard Rodgers out. Jordy Nelson, he's out. You've got Aaron Rodgers out for the season on injured reserve. They're going to be missing Jason Spriggs, their tackle. Marius Randall's questionable. Clay Matthews is questionable. And, of course, we know Bulaga, Montgomery, Rollins all out indefinitely for the season for sure. So who in the hell are the Packers playing, Bobby?
I think the answer is Michael Clark here. That's the guy I'm going to go roll with anyway. This guy's big. He's got, what did he run, a 4.5 40, and he's 6'6". I really think he's got some talent. He had nine targets last week. I think he could get – I'm leaning him ahead of Geronimo Allison, but I think both of them are firmly in play. We've seen Allison have big games in similar type of spots in the past where they were somewhat meaningless and Green Bay was resting players. It's not so ideal with Hundley, but I think that Michael Clark is the guy I'm probably leaning the most towards. But again, there's a lot of value out there, so you could go a lot of different ways, but this is probably the guy who I'm most interested in this spot on the Green Bay side of the ball. And then on Detroit's side, I think that you could really make a case for just about anyone against the Green Bay defense. It's been somewhat skeptical, or I don't know, they've just been sort of they're shaky defense. So I personally am leaning towards Clark, but there's just so many plays and so many games out there. He's probably the one I'm leaning towards the most. I was thinking about maybe potentially playing Galladay on the other side, but not sure I need that value. I think that Clark is where I'm probably going to put my flag in in this game.
Man, Galladay is just staring at me, but like you said, I mean, you don't even need the guy this week, and it's unfortunate because I just have this sick feeling we're going to see that massive game that he probably is capable of. If you watch the preseason, he had a couple multi-touchdown game show up in the box score for you there if you played him in that particular format. So, again, lots of injuries here for the Packers. Looks like Bobby's interested in some value. Guys like 6'6", could be up against one of the reserve cornerbacks. Chris, we were talking about this before the show. Looks like they could be without Lawson this week on the Detroit side of the ball. How about the Detroit side of the ball, though? We talked briefly about Galladay there, but what about the starters? What about Matthew Stafford? What about Golden Tate? What about Marvin Jones against this team that is going to be missing basically not only their entire starting secondary, but then the guys who are behind them?
Yeah, this is fascinating because, first of all, I'll start by saying I think the best play, if you're looking for a play on the Detroit side of the ball, is Matthew Stafford. And you guys kind of alluded to it. He's just been spreading the ball around, and it's kind of tough to peg exactly where he's going to go because, there's talent everywhere, whether it's at the running back position with Riddick and Abdullah, or it's, at tight end with Ebron coming on, or at the receiver position with Galladay, Jones, and Golden Tate. So I think Stafford is kind of the guy where you just kind of get all that production, and maybe you don't even try to deal with the headache of exactly who to stack him with. But Green Bay is another defense that's been interesting, similar to Tampa Bay, where Green Bay also in Week 12, they gave up a monster game to Antonio Brown. So he went for 10 catches, 169 yards, and a couple touchdowns in Week 12. Since that game, Green Bay has been better against number one wide receivers as well. Mike Evans, only 2 catches, 33 yards on 6 targets. Then Josh Gordon had the touchdown, but after that, he was pretty much shut down. So he ended up with only 3 catches for 69 yards and the touchdown on 6 targets in that game. Then they held Devin Funchess to 1 catch for 19 yards on 4 targets in Week 15. Adam Thielen, only 2 catches, 24 yards last week, although there was some bad weather in that game. But what's happened with Green Bay is they've actually given up more production lately to the number 2 wide receiver of opponents, Corey Coleman, 5 catches, 62 yards and a touchdown in Week 14. Week 15, Demir Bird, 3 catches, 25 yards, 2 scores. And then the next week after that, last week, Stephon Diggs, 5 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown. Now, the difficult thing with that is who is Detroit's number 1 and number 2 at this point. Golden Tate has a slight edge over Marvin Jones in targets, but Marvin Jones kind of that number 1 perimeter guy. So it's really tough to say. Green Bay's been doing a lot better, playing some man coverage schemes, and that's been working for them for whatever reason. When they get in those zones with those kind of replacement level cornerbacks, it hasn't worked out as well. But Demarius Randall has been able to hold his own in man coverage lately. It looks like Devon House is going to play as well. So I think Stafford is the play there. And on the other side of the ball, I think Michael Clark definitely is somebody you want to watch. There in Week 16. Only one player in the league got more air yards than Michael Clark, even though he caught only 3 passes for 36 yards on 9 targets, which is good for somebody coming out of nowhere, 9 targets, but 182 air yards, an average depth of target of 20.2. That's per airyards.com. So Michael Clark, there's a lot of missed opportunities there where, there's some hidden upside. And one thing to keep in mind as well, Brett Hundley has played better on the road than at home, and they are on the road indoors here. So weather not going to be a factor. There is a chance that you could maybe see a little bit of a higher scoring, sloppy kind of game than you might otherwise expect, even though Green Bay has all these injuries. But one other guy to keep in mind is Jamal Williams, the running back for the Packers, because the Lions have been getting scraped in the run game ever since Haloti Ngata, their defensive tackle, went down for the season. Jamal Williams played over 90% of the snaps last week. The backup Aaron Jones looks like he's going to miss this game with a knee injury, so Williams could get a full workload. And Detroit is 30th in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. So I think Williams is a guy, 20-touch upside, can catch the ball in the backfield as well. He's a guy that could have a big game even though they're on the road.
I also think that Williams might end up getting overlooked somewhat just because he's in that sort of mid-tier price range, and I think people are going to sort of go stars and scrubs with the way that they do things this week. And I really, really like the Jamal Williams call. I think he's in, you got a potential for a monster game here from him at what I think should be somewhat low ownership.
I think once I have a chance to kind of digest what people are going to be able to digest from all this injury information and try to, gauge where they are valuing some of these guys, because I think this is going to be a week where the actual value of the player is going to differ from the ownership percentage more so than in most weeks. A lot of times, the most valuable players end up being the highest owned players on a week, but you're going to see opportunity on a 16-game slate for maybe a guy like Jamal Williams to be undervalued a little bit more so than he even normally would be, because you don't need as much salary relief and because there's so many other alternatives available. So that's an interesting point there on Williams' ownership, Bobby, that I think I kind of buy into. Maybe he's going to be lower owned than he should be. When you talk about some other games here, guys, that are not necessarily as far as the motivated segment is concerned, but have some intrigue for DFS, I want to talk just a little bit about what's happening in the Washington versus the New York Giants game. Now, it should be really cold in this game. The over-under just 39.5, and the Redskins are actually favored in this spot. I want to talk about a specific player, Chris, though, that I think that you have some interest in. Let's talk just a little bit about Josh Doctson for the Washington Redskins. Now, if you're a big believer in wide receiver cornerback matchups, which I do think there's some flaws in this types of analysis, I think that you'll see plenty of times where Doctson is going to get lined up with Brandon Dixon. Of course, Janoris Jenkins, he out. You talk about Eli Apple, he won't be playing in this game. So you're going to be looking at a guy like a Brandon Dixon potentially getting lined up with Doctson. Let's talk about who this guy is athletically for just a second. This is a guy that ran a 4.4 40, 85th percentile, a guy who ran 90th percentile height-adjusted speed score as far as all of his speed measurables are concerned. So this is a guy who's really, really fast. And this is all per playerprofiler.com, by the way. But when you take a look at some of his other workout metrics, his burst score, 8th percentile burst score, 20th percentile agility score, 24th percentile catch radius. And again, we're just talking about the athleticism of this guy and how he might match up with a guy like Josh Doctson. You look at what Doctson was able to register. Now, he was pretty fast, right around the 70th percentile in 40-yard and speed score, but his other metrics, the ones that Dixon did not perform well, are really interesting to me. 97th percentile burst score athlete, 81st percentile agility score, 96th percentile catch radius. I think that this is a situation where when you talk about pure athletic matchups, if this guy ends up one-on-one with Dixon for any particular portion of this game, that Doctson probably has a pretty big advantage over this. So, Chris, I want to throw this to you first. What do you think about Doctson, both from what I just mentioned from an athleticism and matchup standpoint, and also from how the Redskins might intend to use him in this game?
Yeah, I'm on board. Those are some great numbers that you threw out there to crystallize it even more. But essentially, the Giants are playing replacement level players throughout their secondary. There's nobody there anymore. I mean, Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie is really the only guy, and he lines up in the slot. So you're going to have kind of replacement level players on the outside. And Doctson, I mentioned Michael Clark got 182 air yards last week and was second in the league. Well, the league leader last week of all players was Josh Doctson with 191 air yards. He actually got 13 targets against the Denver Broncos, only caught 2 of them, but the 2 he did catch was for 61 yards and a touchdown. So I think Dotson's a guy that as this season winds down, that's one thing that Washington does want to see, is they want to see exactly what they have in Doctson. And he actually has a team-leading 33% of Washington's air yards since Week 10. So last week wasn't just an aberration. This has been an ongoing trend that they've ever since Terrell Pryor has kind of been phased out and then went on the injured reserve. Josh Doctson has been highly targeted in terms of downfield targets, and 1/3 of air yards. That's a very good percentage, and against this Giants defense, that's exactly what you want. You want guys who are going to be targeted down the field, and there's going to be little resistance. And so you can, if you get one of those plays to hit, against this Giants team, which ranks it's given up the second most schedule-adjusted fantasy points in the league to opposing wide receivers. I think Dotson could be in for a pretty big day, and just 13 targets against the Broncos. I mean, if you're getting 13 targets against the Broncos, then they're obviously just kind of force feeding you the ball. That's what that says, and I think that you're going to see that continue this week in the final game. I really think they do want to see what they have in him.
Bobby, so let's talk about this game just for a little bit here.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Bobby. I was going to throw it to you anyway. I just want to talk about what's going on in the rest of this game. So we like Dotson, any takes on him, and any takes on what's going on with the rest of that offense in Washington?
I mean, the thing is, it'd be tempting to. There is, I guess, against this one of the all-time terrible teams against tight ends, this Giants defense, that what they've done so far this year. But I think you'd be tempted with Davis. But for me, I'm just gonna limit it to Dotson on that side. I really think that, like I said, like Chris said, if you're gonna force feed him the ball that many times against the Broncos, and you do it in this matchup, this is gonna be this. There's a potential for a monster week. Dotson's one of my favorite plays on the whole board, but I don't know that I'm going to be looking at a ton of other places except for at Cousins. Cousins and Dotson are probably my heaviest interest in this game on that side. On the other side, I am having trouble figuring out who to play. I've probably played too much Roger Lewis and fallen in love with the targets instead of the results, but it hasn't really done much for me. So he would be the guy who I was sort of like leaning towards, but with all the other value out there, for me, it's mostly just Dotson and Cousins in this game. I can understand playing Ingram. I don't know. For me, I don't see the need to go on this Giants passing team. I'm grossed out by the Giants offense as a whole. So I'm going to limit it just to those two pretty much.
I would be floored if the Giants win this game, by the way. It's just floored. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what incentive do they have to win this game? Yeah,
and Ingram's actually ruled out. Sorry to cut you guys up. Ingram's actually ruled out, as is Sterling Shepard and Tavares King, it looks like. So, yeah, it's going to be tough for the Giants offense. But Lewis would probably be that guy to lead them in targets now that all those guys are ruled out.
Yeah, so that, again, just wanted to make sure we touched on what's going on with the passing game for Washington there. I really do think Cousins and Dotson have a chance as a pairing in DFS this week. As far as, the other games that we talked about, I don't have a lot that I want to retouch on as far as the teams that actually have some motivation. Just want to talk really quickly about Buffalo. Bobby, one more time. We touched on LaShawn McCoy very, very briefly and Kenyon Drake very, very briefly. Those two running backs in that particular game, that looks like there's just going to be a ton of volume to be had, right?
Yeah, and we're looking for places to spend up realistically. I mean, I think one strategy to go with this week would be to leave some money on the table, but I love both those guys, and they're two guys who I'm looking at, and it's not like you're spending way up for them, but if you're looking at guys to spend up for, I feel like both those, Drake and McCoy, make perfect sense. And it's funny because there used to be the whole narrative in DFS, you don't play two running backs from the same game. That's completely out the window, obviously, these days, especially with the pass-catching backs. So I think this is a really good spot to play both of them. But I don't know if I'm going to go anywhere else. I don't think that it's horrible to play anyone else. It's just it's too big of a slate, and there's too many other options for me to fall too in love with Tyrod or anybody else in this matchup.
Chris, last part here in the segment about the Vegas lines. When you take a look at the 39 over/under 3-point favorite for the Dallas Cowboys in this spot, any interest on the Dallas Cowboys side of the ball? We touched a little bit on Philadelphia, but we didn't really touch too much on Dallas.
Yeah, I think you could, there's so much value that you could afford somebody like Zeke in a tournament. And I mean, we don't know if he's going to play the whole game or what exactly they're going to do, but I'm sure being that he was, out for so long that he's going to want to kind of rack up some numbers. I think he can get to 1,000 yards in this game. So I think Zeke is an interesting tournament play, but beyond that, it's kind of tough. I mean, the Eagles defense has been getting shredded at times, but Des Bryant is somebody that he's just kind of struggled all season, really, on his sideline routes and creating separation on those fade routes and those go routes down the sideline, and that's kind of robbed him of a lot of upside. And him and Dak just really haven't been on the same page on those routes. So it's really looking to me like, I think Zeke is worth it just as kind of, everyone's going to be playing all these cheap running backs. And, if you're getting even maybe 3/4 from Zeke, he could do some major damage against a team that is resting its players. So that would be the guy I'm looking for. He needs 120 yards to get 1,000 on the season. I think that's something that he'll want to accomplish in this game.
A great point there. All right, that's going to wrap up our segment on Vegas for the week. Now let's move over to the chalk, Bobby. Let's talk a little bit about who we think is going to be pretty highly owned at running back. Now, originally in my projections, I was not real sure who was going to be in and out. I had some of these guys like Oliver and Shark Kendrick, West, and some of these Malcolm Brown, these replacement guys is potentially being high owned. Now I'm not so sure that's going to be the case. I am pretty damn sure that we're going to see high ownership on Derrick Henry still. Probably not as high as I originally had it, noting that the Jaguars are going to likely play their starters for some portion of this game. But I still think that he gets enough touches that he's extremely viable in DFS. Do you want to play him?
Yeah, I'm interested in him, but I think that, being a tournament player, mostly I'm okay with completely fading as well. Just enough other options that I'm interested in. And there's a lot of different ways you can build your lineups this week. You can pay down at running back. You can pay down and take shots at some of these, receivers. And I don't even think they're shots. I think you got receivers in the 4 to 5K range that could end up being top 5 receivers. So I think that for me, I'm going to stick to the guys who are going to be a little around. I'll probably be a little lower on the field than Henry, but he is a great play. It's just strictly from an ownership perspective. I don't know entirely where everything else is going to go. Like you said, it's a tough week to figure out, so I don't envy your job at this moment. But I think Dion Lewis should get some, and I think I'd be surprised if Drake doesn't get some ownership, and Kamara as well. Those would be the guys who I would be pretty sure would get some pretty high ownership regardless. I still think Malcolm Brown will get some ownership, even though he's not a guy I'm looking at heavily. But that's pretty much the guys I have.
All right, Chris, chalk running backs, where you landed so far. I mean, how do you feel about Henry and Lewis, and is there anyone else that you think gets some traction here from an ownership perspective?
Yeah, I think Henry's, with Murray officially ruled out, I think Henry's in a good spot. I didn't really want to be playing Henry necessarily if Murray was going to kind of gut it out, and there was just going to be a lot of uncertainty is exactly what's going on. But if Henry is going to be that guy in a must-win situation, I think you do want to look at him. I think he's a kind of a pretty solid cash game play. The Jaguars actually rank 25th in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. They rank in the top 10 against every other position. So the Jaguars that's where they kind of funnel fantasy production is through the running back. And, and that's with all their starters healthy. So if they happen to maybe pull some guys in the second half or whatnot, I think you're still going to see Henry get that workload because they can't take any chances, the Titans. But so I think Henry's in a solid spot. I'm waiting to see exactly what transpires in New England. As far as Lewis, it looks like you have Mike Gillislee has a knee issue, and Rex Burkhead's probably not going to play. And then, James White, he's banged up as well. So Lewis could be in for a heavy workload, but we got to see exactly what their plan would be if Lewis would be the only, one of those 4 to go. What would they do with the backup? Because I know throughout most of the year, they've been kind of hestant to play Lewis, for more than 15 or so touches, and then until the last game where he got a ton of work, 29 carries, I believe it was. So, will they want to do that again with the number 1 seed at stake? But at the same time, they do have other ways to go about it. Lewis is a guy who's kind of on the smaller side. I don't know if they want to continue running him, giving him that super high workload when they still got a home field wrapped up in the for at least one playoff game. So that'll be kind of interesting. I'll be looking toward the beat reporters and to see exactly what they think will happen with Dion Lewis. But besides that, yeah, I think it's going to be the same guy. It's going to be Kamara. It's going to be LaShawn McCoy. I think will get decent ownership because people can afford him. Kenyon Drake as well, because he's going to come up high in a lot of projection systems, with Damian Williams looking doubtful now as we are on the show. So I think those are going to be the main guys, McCoy, Drake, Kamara. And then depending on what happens with Melvin Gordon, I think you'll see some ownership on Brandon Oliver if Melvin Gordon sits. But that game is a late game. And so it might be a situation where people are kind of seeing if they can pivot, maybe they'll pivot from Malcolm Brown to Oliver if Gordon's inactive or something like that. But that's a little tougher situation just because it's one of the late games. So I think maybe you might see in a little ownership, maybe not as much ownership on those guys only because that is the late game and there might be some uncertainty there and people might just go in a different direction and kind of lock in the guys they know are definitely going to play. So I think that's, it is kind of tricky this week. Alex Collins is a guy who's gotten some buzz. I think he'll have, definitely in the double digits of ownership as well. And then after that, it's kind of a crapshoot. I mean, I'm sure you see some Jamal Williams, some CJ Anderson, and some guys like that, but it's kind of a crapshoot after those first handful of guys.
Wild week. I mean, you keep rattling off names, and there's more names you could keep saying that people theoretically could be owned on a normal week that won't probably get a lot of ownership this week. Bobby, when you take a look at the wide receiver position, two of the most sure guys this week that I think will have ownership are Julio Jones and T.Y. Hilton for different reasons, but basically the same reason. Relative to their price tag, they're capable of outperforming by quite a distance based on their matchup and their role in their offenses and all the other factors that might equate to them having a successful game. What about Keenan Allen, though? Because he's a guy that probably should be heavily owned given his role in the offense for that exact reason, but I'm not 100% sure that we'll see him towards the top. I am thinking it's very likely. So what do you think about Keenan Allen?
I think he'll get some ownership, but I honestly don't think it'll be at quite as high as these other guys. And I think it should be. I'm all about Keenan Allen this week, but he tends to be someone who's he's had his few weeks where he's been more chalky, but for the most part, he's been a guy who's been overlooked like throughout his entire career in DFS, at least throughout the last 3 years that I've been playing seriously. And I think that you could see him sort of fall down a little bit on the list, which would make me have much heavier interest in him because I wouldn't be at all surprised if Keenan Allen just says, by far and away the number one scorer. But him and Julio I have right there next to each other in terms of who I want. Julio I have as a slight edge, but Keenan Allen should, I think, be pretty chalky. And I totally agree that T.Y. Hilton and Julio are going to be the super chalk for good reason. But I don't really know. I don't know other than that. I think it's going to be pretty spread out. I think you're going to see a lot of interest in Dotson. I think people are aware enough of what this guy is capable of, and we've talked about him enough. Enough experts have talked about him enough, and I think that I'm hoping it's wrong, but I think that it's going to be pretty high on him as well. But other than that, I think you're going to look at a pretty spread out ownership.
Don't tell anyone I said this, but I don't think this is a week where your first thought about whether you should play a guy or not should even really involve ownership unless you're thinking about guys trying to get guys who have just tremendous prospects for success under 5%, because I don't think the fading the high ownership guy conversation is a good conversation when there's 16 games, lots of options, and you're just not going to find a tremendous amount of leverage over a huge chunk of the field on really anybody this week, at least the way I see it right now. Chris, when you take a look at the tight end position, maybe this is a spot where you could find some leverage in ownership. When you talk about a guy like Gronk, if you do the math here, and they don't have too many running backs to go to, and Tom Brady's pretty good, and the Jets aren't exactly a team that you can't throw on by any stretch of the imagination, and Gronk scores touchdowns, more so than any tight end in history, essentially, maybe more so than any player in history. I don't remember what the exact stat is I heard, but this guy just absolutely can get in the end zone like no other, and he's got a Hall of Famer as his quarterback, and they're looking to win the game. So what do you think about Gronk this week? Do you think he's going to be too heavily owned to invest in?
No, I don't really think Gronk is ever too heavily owned, honestly, because he always has the highest upside of any tight end on the slates. I mean, even if he's getting into that, 20, 25, percent range, if, 3/4 of the field still don't have the highest scoring tight end on a week where he goes off, it's going to be tough. So I think Gronk is clearly the top play at the position. And, going beyond that, I think you'll see ownership on guys like Charles Clay, who's had some success against Miami in the past. I think you'll see, Ebron, Jack Doyle, we mentioned. I think those guys will get some ownership. And Antonio Gates. The Raiders actually have given up the most yards in the league to the tight end position this season. So that's a plus for Antonio Gates to kind of repeat what he did. And, maybe I guess you'll probably see, some people on Vance McDonald just because of how poor Cleveland has been at defending the tight end position. But I think that, McDonald's ownership will probably decrease now that they're going to start Landry Jones. So I think it actually might be good for McDonald because I think he'll still get a lot of work, because he's kind of, he's not really the starter. He's just a top pass catching tight end at this point. When he's been healthy, they've used Jesse James as a blocker more. So even though the backups are playing, I think you'll see McDonald still get a good good usage in this game. So he's interesting. But I think those 5-6 guys are really where most of the ownership is going to go at tight end this week.
Excellent stuff, guys, on the chalk. Now we're going to cap off our show with a look at a guy that we think could go under the radar, somebody that you think could be available at low ownership, and there will be many to choose from this week. So, Chris, I'm going to start with you. When you take a look at the landscape and you see all the attention being put on these games where everyone's got motivation, you see lots of attention on high-owned plays with high probability of success, who's got a high ceiling that you think is going to be low-owned this week?
Yeah, so, everyone's, all the talk is going to be about all these backups and all these low-salary guys and all these situations and how to take advantage of that. But, one guy I'm looking at that hasn't really been talked about as much is Josh Gordon. I mean, Josh Gordon is, talk about motivation. The Browns, now they see kind of a light at the end of the tunnel where it looked like they for sure were going to go 0-16 if the Steelers were going to play their starters in this game and try to lock up that number 1 seed. But now with the Steelers resting players, you look at the Browns and all of a sudden they're highly motivated to come out and give it their all in this game because they could get a win, and nobody wants to be part of that 0-16 team. So I think you look at that, if the Steelers are resting players, they could potentially rest Joe Hayden, who struggled with injury this year. They could rest their other top corner, Artie Burns, as well. And I think this is a situation where, listen, Josh Gordon, he actually leads the league in market share of air yards this season for his team. So he's another guy that, even though the stats haven't always been there, DeShone Kizer has been inaccurate and whatnot, but Josh Gordon, 47% of Cleveland's air yards since he has returned, that leads the league. It's 1 percentage point higher than A.J. Green. So I think Gordon has a ton of upside in this game. And if the Steelers are resting starters, that actually just improves the situation, even though the over-under went down. So maybe you kind of think the opposite, that this is just going to be kind of a game that you should just completely ignore. But I'm looking at it like, hey, the Steelers aren't really going to be motivated. The Steelers are going to be playing some backups, and the Browns are going to be highly motivated just because they don't want to go 0-16. And Gordon is their best player. He's getting, essentially half of all their air yards. So why not just kind of air it out and see what happens in this game if you're Cleveland and try to be aggressive and get this win. I think Josh Gordon has a ton of upside here.
Great call on Gordon there. I think Bobby is going to be all aboard with that one based on his smile right now.
I was literally about to say, I had. It's funny because all these plays we have, and that was the one guy who I was just 100% going to say, I just thought it was funny because we have so many guys we could choose from, but that was the guy who I would have picked as well, and I think he makes for a great play. I also think we mentioned Jamal Williams, and I think one guy who also I think is going to get way overlooked is C.J. Anderson. They've been sort of force-feeding the ball. He's got a shot at 1,000 yards. Actually, he's only 54 away. I think this is a really good spot for him against a KCD that's not going to be all there. So he's a guy who I think is going to go a little bit overlooked, and a guy with really, 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 really high upside. He put up 28 last week against Washington, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a similar type of result this week.
We all know that I'm a fish who does not learn his lesson, but I've got a play here that I think is going to be a little bit lower owned than even one might suspect he would be, just based on his matchup and situation. Now, for whatever reason, Russell Wilson was still one of the highest owned players last week, and he continued to disappoint. Another player on that team that continues to disappoint if you've been rostering him is Doug Baldwin. And when I look at how the Arizona Cardinals come on defense, they've got Patrick Peterson, who's obviously a very strong cornerback, and Tramon Williams has also played very well, which leaves them to the interior of the defense. As far as if you are going to have success and you're going to be passing the ball against Arizona, you're probably going to be doing it with somebody who lines up in the slot or a tight end or a running back out of the backfield, or somebody who is not going to be going up against Patrick Peterson and Tramon Williams. So when I take a look at the Seattle Seahawks and I see they're projected or implied for 24 points or so, and we expect them to move the ball and win this game at home, well, how are they going to do it? Are they going to be running the ball against the Arizona Cardinals? I don't think so. Are they going to be absolutely mowing them down with Richardson and Lockett on the outside? I don't think so. Is it going to be all Jimmy Graham and his inconsistent performance? Probably not. I suspect if the Seahawks are going to have success in this game, it's probably going to involve Doug Baldwin, and I just can't imagine he's much higher owned than 10% with all the options that are on this slate. So I'm kind of interested in going back to the well with Doug Baldwin. As I mentioned, I'm a fish who does not learn his lesson, and I will, in fact, pay once again when I have Doug Baldwin on my teams this week.
I like
guys. we are done with the regular season edition of Sharp DFS Analysis. Chris, any parting shots?
Oh, man, thank you guys for tuning in and listening to us this whole year. We'll see if we're back for the playoffs, but if not, again, just thank you guys for listening. I hope we were able to give you guys something to think about and help you with your DFS game.
Bobby, any parting words for Week 17's actions?
Yeah, I really appreciate being on the show. And for me, I think that it might be one of those weeks so you don't worry about spending all your salary. It sounds crazy on a 16-game slate, but I don't think you need to do that. And I think we might be forcing in some of these higher-priced guys more than we might need to, just because there's a lot of plays out there that I feel pretty confident in the mid to low tier this week.
Awesome job, guys. Bobby, we'll look forward to seeing you more on RotoGrinders.com. People, please make sure to check out 4for4.com and everything that Chris Raybon is up to. Also, be sure to check out the DFS MVP podcast. Excellent listen each and every week. For Bobby, for Chris, I'm Chris, and best of luck in all of your Week 17 contests.